Okay. Jesse Michels, American Alchemy with Sammy from UAP Gerb. If you have 3 hours to dedicate to this, go watch it. It's so good. It's like drinking from a fire hose, again, from both of these guys. They're incredibly smart. Their recall is amazing. Jesse Michels is to theory as Sammy from UAP Gerb is to the history and the time frames and the documentation of the UAP conversation.
I'm just so impressed by you, and I'm grateful to call you a friend, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. So it's an honor to have you here, man.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm happy to be back. I mean, we recorded last time in November. Since then, we had the hearings. We had like the Soul Foundation. We had Jake coming forward. We've had so much to touch on. So like you and I talked about, got this back together because a ton of new topics to touch on, old stuff to revisit, new information.
So let's get into it. The key things that they visit here are the Psionics program. You know, now that we have Jake Barber out talking about psionics, and that's how we basically call in or invite in craft.
There is a known and researched and implemented emotional or psychic, or what we call a psionic component to the research and development of the UAP program.
They basically go back and bring up the mentions of this throughout history, MJ12, documents, memos, emails, people who speak about psionic or, for example, Philip Corso, who was pretty famous like back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, I think, and then I think he passed. But he said that they were studying mind control of ICBMs, which are ballistic missiles. And that was back in like the 50s or 60s. So this psionic component has really been going on for years and years and years. So they talk about that. They talk about who does it live under, like who do these psionic programs live under and where they're being developed, and who are they answering to. They talk about soft disclosure in Hollywood, which is so fun. They visit everything from the X-Files to Spielberg to Christopher Nolan, which is really fun and fascinating about how they sort of relate little soft disclosure things in those movies. And then they talk about people who are trying to stop disclosure, and really the people who are ultimately pursuing it for feudalistic power, which I'm willing to bet that in these circles, these men, I will say men because oftentimes and throughout history it has been men who have made these warring decisions, but this pursuit of feudalistic power is feudal, and I bet you they're figuring that out now, and that the NHI are quite pissed. They want their technology back, and they also think that we are too stupid to handle and hold this kind of power, because we can destroy perhaps destroy worlds with this power. So I bet they're starting to figure that out. And if anybody is watching this video from those communities, I really hope you hear me when I say this. It is not up to you. Our fate as a humanity should lie in the hands of the people, not in closed rooms with a lot of white men and a talk about war. Okay? So read my lips on that. We will figure this out, and we will render you obsolete. Okay? We don't need you anymore. We don't need you to lead this conversation. We want to lead it now. Thank you. Okay. Back to the podcast. So, such a fascinating interview with Sammy. Basically, they start out with Jake Barber, and they sort of talk about how he vindicates Dr. Greer, how he vindicates Michael Herrera, who's the guy who talked about seeing the 8 gun in Indonesia after that big natural disaster. They also talk about Jonathan Weygandt, who basically led a crash investigation for Operation Laser Strike in Peru, where they were like doing stuff with ground-based laser systems, and perhaps they downed a craft in Peru. So he went to go investigate it, and apparently he reported this sort of egg-shaped craft with a mother of pearl glimmer on it. Now, if you're familiar with mother of pearl, as a fashion person, I am, because we use those buttons. And when you see real mother of pearl buttons, they have this sort of shimmer to them, almost like oil on water. So he reported seeing an egg-shaped craft, quite like the one that Jake Barber has the video of. So that's really interesting. They correlated those two experiences. They basically talk about how, Jesse asked Jake in his original interview, who are you, who's your employer, and who are these psionic teams under? And Jake basically tells him, look, if you took 2 educated guesses, you'd probably guess it. Now, if Jake said that to me, I would say it's Northrup and Lockheed. Those are the 2 big boys when we talk about this sort of reverse engineering programs. So they kind of validate that it's probably Northrop or it's Lockheed. Who are they answering to? It's a really good question. We don't really know. They guess that maybe it's the DOE. It could be the NSA. It could also be the NRO. But, Jesse also makes the argument that the sort of metamaterial, or like the actual craft, is sort of overhyped, but that the human experience around it with like the psionic component and telepathy is far more interesting, because you've got people who are receiving downloads. That sort of gets into my experience and why I'm so interested in this conversation. I've been interested in it my whole life, but I did receive, or I did have some pretty interesting experiences when I started my meditation practice. And I'll just say, if you've listened to the Dave Rossi interview, it's very similar to that. And that can be found on American Alchemy as well. So they get into like Project Preserve Destiny, which also kind of explores this. It sounds kind of like the Gateway program, where like humans are the antenna, and if you listen to binaural beats, it can sort of bring you into the mode of receiving the transmissions. I will say that in my last TikTok video, or there's a TikTok video where I talk about summoning versus inviting. Go check that one out, because I don't talk about summoning. I talk about inviting, and I talk about how you can get to the place where you start to intermingle with these high signals, and you can start to receive messages or downloads from these NHI. I think it's really interesting because Jesse talks about how he's got an upcoming interview with somebody who was procured from the GATE programs. I'm super excited about that. I think we're going to learn a lot more about that. I was in a GATE program. It wasn't called GATE. It was called GO, Gifted Opportunity. But there was like some interesting things around that when we were in like 3rd grade. We were sort of procured, and we were basically taken into like different learning areas, and it was like weird and strange. Anyway, so I'm interested to hear what this person has to say about the GATE programs, and their psionic, like how they get procured. Apparently, when you get high up in those programs, they bring in people like Men in Black type people with, this one person said they brought in like a metallic sphere to see if you had an experience with it or if you could communicate with it, which I thought was interesting. They talk about, I love this story, Andrea Puharich and Phyllis Schlemmer. If you've ever read the Raw Law of One transcripts, or if you've read The Council, that's a book that I really love, and it explores the space transmissions that Andrea Puharich and Phyllis Schlemmer worked on in Ossining, New York back in like the 70s. That was especially interesting because of some of the experiences that I had and the messages I was receiving around perhaps like potential war and helping to meditate for peace. They were doing this. They were basically doing this in the 70s when Iran and Israel and Palestine and all of these things were happening in the Middle East, it was quite amazing. Now, out of these sessions, they basically were like letting the government know what was going on, and they invited in a bunch of creators, one of whom is Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek. And he received information and inspiration from these channeling sessions that helped him create Star Trek. And essentially that was supposed to help us manifest a future of space travel and space commerce with the galactic family. So that was really, really interesting. They go on to sort of talk about, again, like the history of the like mentions of psionics here and there. They said that Philip Corso, who's like very famous in association with Roswell and sort of the events that occurred after Roswell, he claimed that the Foreign Tech Division was using or experimenting with human brainwaves to guide ICBMs, which are ballistic missiles. He wrote a book that was kind of insane, like a little insane. But apparently what happened is he had actually like written this book, and then he had to get it past DOPSR or whatever the process was back then. They added, like his co-writer added a whole bunch of crazy shit to the book. And they gave him 1 day to edit it. And he's like, I can't believe this happened. Like, so I just had to put it out. So only some of it is true, but the reason they did that is probably just to make him look bad or make him look like he was crazy. So that was interesting. They also go into sort of this history with this guy Sarbacher, who did R&D for Vannevar Bush, who was an atomic scientist, who had like this crazy IQ of 200 plus. He was also very close with Townsend Brown, who Jesse Michaels has a documentary on. I'm like waiting. I just like need to go watch that documentary. It's going to be fascinating. They think that he cracked electrogravitics. But basically this guy was working with this other guy who was a Canadian called Wilbert Smith. He was like really good with radios, and he came back to Canada and started Project Magnet, which he like basically was taking his learnings that mental phenomenon were an obsession among the Americans in the 1960s. There's a guy named Eric Walker they discuss, who when interviewed or asked about Majestic 12, which is that other covert program, he referenced a sixth sense, and he said, if you don't know about the sixth sense, you'd never be let in. So he was referring back to that like psionic telepathic ability. They also talk about this guy Leonard, who has like, he mentions like tons of UFO retrievals, and he references headbands and transceivers that help the pilots guide the craft. So he said the pilots were a part of the guidance systems, which is really interesting. Because obviously, like what we're learning now with Jake Barber, like, so this was all happening. This is all happening all along. They're basically making psychics look like crazy people, you know, on purpose to kind of discredit and keep people from pursuing that path. This is what they did. They've done this with countless other topics. They've done it with quantum physics. They did it with UFOs. They did it with psychic. They did like, so anything that has a stigma attached to it, you should probably look into it. It's probably true. I love how Jesse says, anomalies create the new science. He thinks that psionics are the future of physics. And then I wanted to bring this in because I was watching this really amazing physicist the other day, Federico Fagene, I think his name is, and he was saying that the reason why math cannot explain consciousness is because consciousnness created it. And I thought that was amazing. I just, like, loved that. 'Cause, like, if consciousness is at the bottom of the pyramid, you can't explain it with the things that come after. So, they also go on to talk about, like, obviously there's a lot of references to the men who stare at goats. These people like Stubblebine, Buchanan, who are essentially psychic spies. Stubblebine apparently was funding the UFO working group, which precursor was MJ-12. So Majestic 12 turned into the UFO working group in 1986. They also go on to talk about, let's see, okay, so that's all, like, that's like the history of it. There's like a bunch of stuff that they go into where, like, Greer's DPI archive, like Greer's pursuit of CE5, and they're like, you know, yes, it rubs people the wrong way that he's asking for money for this, or like that there's some monetary incentive, but it's pretty incredible that, like, he was early to this in the public and he was trying to teach peaceful contact with the ETs. So that's pretty cool. They talk about, like, that there were plans to kind of disclose this back in 2010. Apparently there was a going public plan, but it was called off by a two-star general. And then apparently also Bush 43 had Hal Puthoff as an advisor, and if you know who that is, he has like a very deep history in UAP and UFO conversations within the government. They basically had a conversation with Stephen Hadley and Dick Cheney being the VP, and decided it was too ontologically shocking and called it off. But again, it's like, I'm sorry, but I'm so tired of these white men deciding what is okay for us. Like, indigenous people have been saying this stuff for years, and we should have access to this information. We should be able to advance and expand our consciousnesses and evolve. Apparently that group, like, it, like, what turned into, like, it happened after they called it off, was that they started reading Three Body Problem, apparently, which is crazy. And, you know, there was this big rumor that David Grush said that Dick Cheney is, like, basically at the tip of the spear on hiding this this technology and this whole program, all of the programs, that he's sort of the person. They referenced The Angler. There's like a book about Dick Cheney and like how he, you know, basically was like kind of the president and feeding misinformation to Bush during that time so that he could make the decisions that Cheney wanted him to make. That guy's evil. And when he came out in support of Kamala Harris, man, I thought twice. I was like, that guy is evil. He is no good. Why is it a good thing that he's endorsing Kamala? Like, this is crazy. So, anyway, apparently they all started reading Three Body Problem. And that book is all about, now I haven't read it, I gotta read it, but it's all about aliens controlling frontier science and that they can like stagnate or they can upstart physics. So I can't believe they were reading that. I thought that was crazy. And then they go on to talk about the soft disclosure from Hollywood, and this is really fun. So they got into how Spielberg definitely had some spooky connections because he was the executive producer on Back to the Future, and basically that whole movie is about how gravity and time are linked, and they used a lot of references to Thomas Townsend Brown, okay, who Jesse's convinced cracked anti-gravity and electrogravitics. Now, the character in Back to the Future's name is Doc Brown. Okay, that's what they called Thomas Townsend Brown, apparently. The character's name is Emmett, full name, Emmett Brown, ending with a TT, so TT Brown, okay? In 1985, he goes back to 1957, and that's basically when Thomas Townsend Brown died, 1985, and he goes back to 1957, which is when, like, anti-gravity research went black, and Bonson Lab kind of took over, and nothing got out. Nothing went any further. So it's really, really interesting, all of those little synchronicities and connections. They also talk about E.T., which is like one of my favorite movies. If you don't know, my initials are E.T. So favorite movie ever. They talk about how, you know, only the kids can see E.T. when he's in the kitchen, and like the mom is like not in the right headspace, so she's like, you know, she's so distracted she can't see him. And then they get into, you know, they talk about D'Souza being tapped by X-Files to kind of advise on what they should put in the show, and then it turns out that there's these like triangle crowd, like there's so many references to things that you can find in this documentation in the X-Files. They also talk about Men in Black, which I think is quite fascinating because there's something called TREAT. It stands for something, and it's like engineering and something, but it's like the Men in Black version. Like, it references Men in Black. And basically, Hal Puthoff suggests that perhaps, like, this is some sort of, like, joint space program, because the only other reference to it is from the Prince of Liechtenstein. So could this be sort of that elite, like, world group of decision makers who are working together? You know, they talk about how apparently Bob Lazar said that there were Russians at Area 51, and then Jonathan Weygandt said, the guy who found the egg-shaped craft in Peru or investigated that crash, also said that he went to a base where there were Chinese and Russians working together. Like, apparently we may have been coordinating with the Soviets on this because we didn't want them to think it was us, and they didn't want us to think it was them if we saw stuff in the sky, so like we were coordinating on this stuff. Immaculate Constellation alludes to a collaboration between the countries. Immaculate Constellation was the thing that Michael Schellenberger had revealed during the second congressional hearing on all of this. So lots of like very interesting references to where does this live? Who does it answer to? Is it international? Is it under our government? They reference something called, where is it? It's like a continuity of government. A continuity of government program. Basically, John Alexander said that Majestic 12 was one of those. But he said it had nothing to do with UFOs. But then, like, somebody called him out and was like, no, you're a liar, because it did deal with UFOs. What else do they talk about? I mean, there's just so much here. So much information. They go on to talk about how, I thought it was interesting because they talk about how, like, there's kind of this, you know, Grush pieced a lot of stuff together, and when he briefed Thomas Mannheim said it was urgent and credible, but yet nothing has been done up until this point. Jesse said that he actually tweeted something about this, and somebody threatened to sue him. I guess it was about so I guess they were trying, like, basically the press came out with a story that was trying to discredit Dave Grush. And it was this kid journalist, Ken Klippenstein. He wrote about how Dave Grush had, like, maybe a drinking problem. And in a later interview, Ken admitted, it was like the Breaking Point interview, Ken admitted that the DOD tipped him off and wanted him to write a bad story about Grush. And so he did. And apparently, like, and so he works for The Intercept. And then apparently recently, documentation has come out under the DOJ investigations of U.S. aid that they were funding The Intercept. So there's some like really weird connections there. Ultimately, though, you know, they end on how a lot of these programs, again, are like geared towards this feudalistic power and control of this technology and weaponization of this technology. And I'm just so glad that I see this conversation coming from American Alchemy and Jesse Michels about how, like, we cannot continue like this. And if people are in pursuit of this, they're going to have bad experiences with it. Because, again, your experience with the phenomenon is a direct reflection of you. So if you're in pursuit of weaponization, you're probably going to have a hitchhiker effect. It's going to follow you home. It's going to harass you. And it's not going to be good. So I also think it's worth mentioning that they do get into, this is something I asked myself when I saw that Jake Barber episode, where he talks about being really proud of, like, the psionic teams, but then openly admits that there are some things happening that are not great, like the treatment of kids, perhaps the drugging of kids, perhaps the procurement of indigenous children. And it does make me think of all of the rumors about missing children from some of these national disasters, and, you know, they don't want to talk about it. It's really strange. So I think we have to ask questions about that. We have to ask questions about the nature of this work and what they're doing with children, and what they're doing with people in general, especially indigenous people. I'm not okay with that. So I am hoping that if the Hopi prophecy is correct, then we will have some sort of purification and outing of anybody who's doing this for a bad reason. So what a crazy deep interview with, like, the most insane information. And, you know, I've kind of gone through my notes here. I've already been going for 30 minutes. So I'm going to stop there, because if you want to know any more, I think you should probably go watch the episode. But it's always really such a pleasure to listen to Jesse and his guests. He gets such good guests. So anyway, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed it, and leave a comment below if you have any questions.